Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Ian Saunders. I am the Assistant Dean of Artistic and Social Change here at Longy, and I'm one of the newest members of senior leadership. If this is your first time joining us at Longy, thank you so much. We're fortunate to have you experience these wonderful panelists with us and also kind of take part in the Longy community. Our mission here at Longy is to prepare students to be the musicians the world needs. We're empowering them to make differences with their music and artistry. The world is filled with voices that deserve to be heard, and that's a sentiment that we deeply believe here at Longy, which brings us to our topic today, which is reckoning within the classical music world. But before we begin, I'd like to say a special thank you to our co-sponsors, the Carey Memorial Library in Lexington and Dunamis in Boston. So, to go to our first guest, I knew him long before I actually met him, which is saying something considering he's on an entirely different coast than I am. But it speaks to the impact of this individual. He is incredible. He's sort of like a thunderstorm in the distance. You hear him coming, and then when he finally sets upon you, he is truly a force. So when I finally got a chance to actually meet him, he actually exceeded expectations, and I could talk to him for days on end without repeating the topic. I'm talking about, of course, Armando Castellano. Armando is a horn player, arts advocate, and founder of Quinteto Latino. Quinteto Latino focuses on building community through Latino classical music and specializes in the performance and advocacy of Latino composers and advocates on behalf of classical musicians of color. Thank you for joining us, Armando.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you. I just want to say something about what you just said, because what happens is, we you and I are navigating systems that are majority white. And when we as leaders of color get together, it's so rare for us to sit by ourselves in the room. We have a lot to talk about. So I can see, when we finally met, there was a lot to say, right?
Exactly, exactly. Instant connection. So jump right into it. So Quinteto Latino's concerts are filled with numerous and varied Latino composers. I'm curious, where and how have you discovered these composers?
Well, I get this question all the time. Like, I could have a whole separate program answering questions about repertoire. I literally every week get repertoire questions. And the reality is that once I decided to move this direction 17 years ago, I merely just started buying all the pieces that passed my desk, and I would just Googled it, and I found many, many pieces to buy. And then once I started having that branding, people started sending it to me. And the reality is that I have boxes of wind quintets by Latino composers, both Latin American, ones that are born and living in Latin America, and ones that are Latino, ones that are born and living in the United States. So much repertoire that I'll never have enough time in my lifetime to perform all of it. And even having the full-time wind quintet doing it, there's so much of it. So it wasn't that difficult to find it and access it.
Okay. So if the music is that easy to find, why isn't music by Latino composers programmed and studied more?
Well, I think that I'm going to tell you a story about what happens often when people find out what I do. First of all, as a brown man in the classical music space, I'm often seen as a jazz musician, right? I play the French horn. I'm a classically trained musician. So that's one thing. Another thing is it's about stereotypes, right? Another thing is because I'm Quinteto Latino, and the Latino word is there, there's an assumption that I'm playing samba or merengue or salsa or banda, all music I love, and we all love and appreciate. I don't play any of that music. I play classical music that sounds like just all other Western classical music, in fact. But in there's a number of hurdles there. There's a visual hurdle of me and my skin color and my name within the field. And then there's the hurdle of the word Latino and the stereotypes and the that associated with that have to be overcome before we can get to actually playing some of the composers and having me present. Having me as a musician.
Great. So you spoke about sort of the barriers to overcome. I'm thinking about arts organizations in general, and of course, we know about musicians. What often gets overlooked are arts administration, and I'm sort of thinking to myself, it's remarkable to consider how in 2020 we still have a series of firsts across the arts world, right? So some organizations have their first black CEO, first Latino director, or first female president. And I'm curious to know what are some of the challenges with being the first in those positions, in those organizations that you've come across?
Well, it's pretty endless. I mean, like I just told you how you and I, when we finally spoke, alone, you and I are mostly navigating systems that are majority white. So we have a field that is funded, and the decision makers and the composers we're playing and the majority of the musicians all come from the same identity. They're the ones they're the gatekeepers. They're the ones making the decisions. So when people like you and I want to enter those systems, we have to assume that identity and assume those systems, be knowledgeable about those systems and the way of speaking and the music. So we have, and so any of those levels, staff, musician, administrator, if you're a person of color, you have to be a part of that, the dominant culture. And and also, so as someone new and entering that might look different or sound different, have new ideas or more diverse ideas and is that leadership of color going to be trusted? How you have to hold the position of diversity and color for a whole organization or a whole host of administrators, and that's a lot of work for one person,
Right.
one entry. So whether you're the first staff person or one of the few musicians or first an executive staff or as a board member, I've been in all of those positions. I am in all those positions, and I know what it feels like. And I know the energy and how draining it is to be able to survive and thrive within those systems. So I couldn't imagine. I'm a seasoned artist and arts administrator and board member. But if you're a younger person trying to enter those systems, I know that I want Quinteto Latino to be there to support them in this journey, because it's very hard to want to stay.
Absolutely. Going along that, just to go with that same question, I'm curious. So we have all of these conversations about, diversity and equity, but when we look at who primarily makes up the board, who primarily makes up senior leadership, who primarily makes up these things, it begs the question: will we even need to have this conversation if we did have a diverse board, if we did have a diverse a group of perspectives up there? And so, um,
The answer is no, by the way. Keep going though.
no, 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 no. Please,
Sorry, I didn't
please
let you
go along
finish.
with that. So, I mean, no, no, no. Please explain. So,
I
that's
mean,
sort of
that's
my
the
line of
theory,
thinking.
right? If the funders were diverse and the
Mm,
board members and the arts administrators were diverse, we wouldn't be having a discussion about diverse programming, about diverse musicians, about diverse leadership. It would all just trickle down and be very natural.
right.
I know with my own organization, Quinteto Latino, is we have there's 6 of 7 of us are Latinos on our board, and I think we're the first national organization that is a classical music performing organization that has that kind of diverse leadership at the top. And I think it's because we serve the Latino community, and that's our focus. It's easy for us to find diverse board members and to serve there. And I think it speaks to it was not a problem to find those leaders. I'm constantly asked, like, where can I find some brown and black leaders to be on the board?
Mm,
The fact is, if you're serving those communities authentically and with cultural competency and giving power and voice to those communities, your boards will also just step on too, because they'll see that they're empowering the voices that diverse board leadership cares about.
exactly. Exactly. Long way to go for sure. Armando, well, that just about brings us to the end of our time. I can't wait to have you come back when we have all of the other panelists on discussion as well. As always, it's a pleasure to get a chance to talk to you, and in general, looking forward to getting a chance to work with you.
Sounds good.
So, from what we were just talking about, there is a breadth and there's a depth of music out there that can be explored, um, that we can look into, that goes beyond the canon, that goes beyond the white male voices that typically dominate our concert spaces and concert halls. And I think this is an important thing to consider. But even more so, what Armando was talking about was how we genuinely and effectively give these voices a chance to speak up. It isn't just enough to take the status quo of the canon that we have so far and try to take brown faces, try to take black faces and force them into that box, right? We have to let them speak and say what they want to say authentically and in a very genuine manner. Because people aren't the same, people are different. As a matter of fact, you can come from the same place and have a very different and unique experience. And I say that because our next guest is actually from the same place that I am, which is Hampton Roads, Virginia. So, as you can imagine, it was a thrill to actually discover that when we were talking. I'm from Norfolk, Virginia. She's from Virginia Beach, Virginia. And as we said before, you can have very unique and disparate paths. And so it was wonderful getting a chance to speak with her to kind of learn how the challenges and discoveries she faced while she discovered her voice were different from my own, even being minutes away from each other and growing up minutes away from each other. So, our next guest is Dr. Alexandra Du Bois. She is the chair of Longy's composition department and has made an impression on the world with her music. Dr. Du Bois is a Manhattan and Vermont based composer and violinist whose musical imagery has continually attracted commissions created to honor or mourn world events. She is gaining a lot of attention in the conservatory world as our composition chair. And I can't wait for you all to hear from her yourself. Thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Du Bois.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm so thrilled to be here with you and Michelle and Armando and with Longy, just especially this week.
Absolutely. So, the first thing I want to know is that listening to your music, you have such a unique voice. It's been called gorgeous, haunting, and deeply sincere. How did you cultivate that voice, and how has it developed or grown over the years?
Mm. Well, first of all, I want to have a shout out to Virginia Beach, Norfolk, Hampton Roads, where we grew up. I miss the weather, but today it's been in the 70s up north here, so I'm happy for that. And I wanted to just start out by saying that there's something about one's voice that when you're a young person, you don't even realize that you have a voice. You're a child and you're speaking and you're in your essence, and you think, wow, I can do anything or I cannot do anything. My parents, I grew up in classical music. Neither of my parents were given access to lessons when they were a kid, so they made sure I had violin lessons. I happened to love it, and I knew I wanted to become a violinist at a young age. I never thought I could be a composer. It never dawned on me as a child that I could be a composer. I was going to be a violinist. And when you talk about voice, as composers come from instruments, to compose means to put together. And as musicians, that's where we come. We're playing, we're singing, we're feeling, composition, songwriting, whatever, improvisation, all the types of music we have come out of playing an instrument, be it your physical instrument or an instrument that you hold and touch and sing into. So I didn't really feel that I could be a composer because there was no one around me that I had experienced. So I developed an aversion to the idea of being a composer because of not seeing myself represented. So my voice came about far after that. And I'm kind of not answering your question. I'm answering a question about, trying to answer your question about voice, but it comes down to kind of allowing yourself to be heard, so to speak.
Amazing. And so, as you were trying to find ways for your voice to be heard, I'm curious. Was there ever a time that you felt someone wanted you to sort of conform to an idea or something that you weren't, as you were trying to find your own voice and cultivate that?
I think I came up with like as a young person, sort of this denial that composition could exist for me, for a female, for a girl, for a young woman, because it wasn't a path that existed in the 1980s and 1990s when I was growing up. I fell into it at the really last minute because it was just something that, if you don't see yourself represented, it's not an option. So I developed an aversion to even the idea of being called a composer. And while I created that aversion on the outside, I was listening to myself. I was listening to that small voice that said, no, you do have something to say, but I couldn't call it a composer. Mm-hmm. Because a composer lives in this ivory tower up there in academia, up there in Europe, up there in all of these places that I didn't exist in. And I sort of created this false reality to kind of allow myself to get through that type of wall. You know, a lot of things happen over time, but by listening to my own voice, it overpowered the noise, and kind of like blinders come on, and you just say, you know what, I'm just gonna go ahead and do this. And you end up with sort of a blinding desire to have your own internal monologue be heard by others.
With the internal monologue that you were talking about, I'm curious. I know I've encountered, classes or courses where people have tried to say, sort of, can you guess the composer? Can you guess if the composer is a man or a woman? As if there's something innate in a sound, as far as that can be indicative of saying who's a man or a woman. And I wonder if you've kind of come across that same sort of concept before in your journey.
Absolutely. There's this sort of idea of a female sound and a male sound, at least in the United States where I've grown up, and I've never associated myself with either sound. And there's not a sound. And I think people have tried to unearth that within, living and deceased composers over time. And the idea that there would even be a gendered composer was beyond me before I even thought of gender within music, before I was even thinking about that Brahms and Mahler were men in classical music. I was just thinking about sound. And so when I was funneled into the world of gender as a young person, having denied the idea that I could even be a composer, but then was funneled into, well, you must conform to, now you're not a composer, you're a female composer. I bucked against that really strongly, and I encountered a fair degree of kind of industry backlash for that. And I understand that, and I didn't go through what some of my colleagues went through in terms of breaking some walls down. So I benefited from that barrier breaking, but at the same time, I kind of found myself in terms of all female programs, for example, and what does that mean? And being relegated into this program where all of the females come together and have their music performed. So there's that level as well.
It brings up this interesting balance, right? This idea of how do we sort of celebrate, but not necessarily turn something into a novelty. How can we actually make something sort of normal? And I'm curious to hear maybe how you view, or how can we approach finding this balance between, celebrating women composers who traditionally haven't been celebrated, or even to some extent it's been actively have been actively suppressed not to compose, right? So how can we find this balance between celebrating them but also making sure that it's not, a novelty, or this isn't something uncommon?
Well, I came into music because I love listening. The vibrations of hearing and listening at the same time, I think, is what can heal the world. Healing is listening and creating sound at the same time. This is what musicians do, this cross sounds of coming in and coming out. And so if we're not listening for female composers, if we're not listening for composers of color, we're not listening. So putting a small scope on what is percentages of the population beyond comprehension for the amount of time that notated music has existed. Active suppression needs to be acknowledged tangibly and intellectually, visibly, on every level. So with that is the way to celebrate is to find and discover and look for and be excited about all of the music that you've never found before. And while doing that, acknowledge that it's just a drop in the bucket in terms of what's out there. Just keep, listening for what you haven't heard before, and removing the titles of confinement, basically.
Right. That's a very good point. We have so many titles and names that we naturally, it kind of segregate our canon, right? That those are things that can be removed. Dr. Dubois, thank you so much for your time. It is always wonderful to hear your perspective. Fantastic perspective. And we'll see you a little bit later on in the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Saunders. See you soon.
Absolutely. I think it's a great thing to point out these sort of two things that I'm hearing in the past two panelists, that you have to foster your own voice. You don't want to try to make it ubiquitous or judge the value of it by what it's not, right? That's something that we all have to kind of struggle with, and that's something that we definitely use in order to overcome things. Nobody embodies that better than our next guest. In the classical world, we have canon and repertoire that's centuries old. And it's always interesting to see how it lives and how it breathes in people in this century, and to have that perspective. And so, without hesitation, I implore all of you after this panel discussion to please go out and check out our next guest rendition of Ain't It a Pretty Night from Susanna. Our next guest is Lauren Michelle, the incredible Lauren Michelle. She is a world-renowned soprano. She has been speaking up about the opera world and all the challenges facing Black singers. After her interview with the Washington Post at WQXR this summer, she has become one of the most important voices in opera's reckoning. We're honored to have her spend time with us today. Thank you so much for joining us, Lauren.
Thank you for having me. Did I correct that problem with the video?
I think you could.
Okay, technology is just special, isn't it?
It's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing.
All
so,
right.
so recently you spoke out about racism taking place in the opera world. Was there a catalyst that pushed you to share your own experiences?
Um, yes, I think it was probably out of frustration.
Mm,
In the summer, we all experienced the emotions behind seeing the murder of George Floyd.
right.
And with that, it really brought on sort of this energy, which it was amazing to see how many people were just, ready to start making change. And it was a beautiful thing, this energy, right? And
Mhm.
I started seeing like all these industries starting to, you know, move basically and open their eyes. And I didn't see that happening in the classical world. It was like crickets.
Right.
And I think that people were very open to saying like Black Lives Matter,
Mhm.
but they wouldn't say like Black Lives Matter in classical music, like sort of connecting the dots and seeing like, well, where can we change? And so I realized that if I just stayed quiet, I basically was being a part of the problem, right? And assisting in in assisting, and I couldn't do that. So out of like frustration, not only for the fact that there wasn't really like people really just saying like, this is what it is. Like I experienced this here. This is what it looks like, in not seeing that. And also a frustration with myself too. I was frustrated that I didn't say anything before, right? So there was a lot of frustration. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, what have been some of the things that have taken place in that silence in the opera world?
What have been some of the things that have taken place?
Yeah.
Um, well, so in silence, right? Like silence is interesting because it's actually a tool
Mm.
that's used by oppressors. It's actually a very important tool that they're like people need to have happen in order to continue to do what they're doing, right? They need to not be called out and they need to not be told on, basically. Like
Yeah.
it can't be out there, right? So in the silence, that's basically like that's when everything can happen. Everything and anything can happen in silence. So it's really I guess I hadn't really realized it until until I got ready to say something online. I was like,
Mm.
I had written out like everything I wanted to say, and then I was about to push the button, and there was a hesitation.
Mm.
And I remember that I had to take a moment to like purge that learned behavior, right? Because it was learned. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. This will happen to you. These things will happen, right? So this is all the stuff that happens in the silence. Not only are the oppressors given space
Mm-hmm.
to oppress, but also there's almost like the silence is almost used like as shackles for the oppressed, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah. So to go along with that, when you were saying that you had to fight against all the things that you learned just before you hit send, where does that, where do those lessons start? When does one start learning about? When does one start to learn and be conditioned to go along with the silence?
Well, I think that in particular in classical music, we are taught in school immediately.
Hmm.
We are taught immediately your opinion does not matter. And what you have to say is not important. We're taught that in our lessons, we're taught in our coachings. We're told literally, yes, we want you to interpret the music, but interpret it this way. We want you to make these crescendos here, these decrescendos there. We need you to observe this fermata and not that one. Why? Because of tradition. You know, and so there's a strange culture, right, of behaving. And if you behave and if you perform this correctly, then you will be, you know, rewarded, right, with literally awards. You will actually win a competition because you did it this way, or you will get a grant, or you will get, you know, you'll pass your exam, right? I mean, it's kind of built in, right, to the system to be to not speak, like not have a voice, which is ironic, right? Because
it is.
It's kind of ironic.
It's crazy that when you go to school, there's a tradition of expression, and you think I have to express myself traditionally. Like there's a expression I have to do that way, and that takes a long time to sort of get over. You're exactly right. So you go against the system. You speak out and you say things. What are the risks that come with that?
Well, so speaking out, right, is just shedding a light on the truth, right? And if truth is reality, then, and art is supposed to reflect reality, okay? Then basically what's at risk is the actual art form itself. So we're no longer doing what we're supposed to be doing, right? Which is reflecting reality. And this to me is dangerous, right? So if we had always done that, because classical music didn't always do that, right? So if we had done that before, we would never have the collaboration of Mozart and you know, Dupont with this with Les Notes de Figaro. We would never have that. That was reflecting, you know, reality in such a way that it actually was banned in places, right? And then you have Verdi, who literally, like, Verdi ended up being, his operas were so reflective of what was going on in the lives and in the hearts of Italians, so much that his name became a slogan for, you know, uniting Italy. So art is supposed to reflect reality. And if we don't have that, then we're not really doing art, right? And at the end of the day, it's the actual art form that is suffering. It's the actual music. It's the actual score. Like we have to be able to be artists.
Exactly. You know, it's so interesting that you're bringing up this idea that, you know, art has to reflect things. We don't necessarily have to confine it and put things on it that way. And I think that's really interesting, and it's really important for conservatories to do that, right? Conservatories not to have a preemptive way of expressing oneself. It's just something that we sincerely also believe that happens at Longy as well. But also to go along with some of the things that you spoke out about and you said before, I mean, there's this thing, right? If I say something or you say something, and that wasn't by coincidence that I said that, there's a lot of risk that comes with that. There's a lot of risk with speaking out. You're not safe, you know. You're not. You can be black and you can talk and you can say all of that, but I need you to say it this way. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
And so with that said, you know, why is it necessarily that, one, we have to take all that risk? What should white anti-racist voices say in this space? And then two, what can we do to make sure that when Black folk want to speak up, they can speak up?
Well, I'll answer it backwards, right?
Sure.
So, what can, look, you know, this is not rocket science, okay? It's a human being, right? We're talking about, because it always baffles me, like, oh, how can this be? Like, how can we have, I see these, you know, like this panel or like all these panels that have existed and all of this, there's so much discussion.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, like, you just need to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
You just got to look in the mirror and you got to clean up. Okay. If, and I really think it's like as simple as that. There should be, of course, space. Of course, there should be space for Black people to be able to, I mean, we're talking about just being humans. Like, this to me is so, like, this is so basic. This is so basic. Myself as an example, I should be able to sing at home on a regular basis. I should be able to do that. My family should be able to hear me perform. And we have the structure of our United States of America in classical music is such that voices that have, I don't know, that have something to, like we were saying, that have something to say, right? So maybe I don't put the decrescendo in that place.
Right.
Maybe I decide to put it somewhere else. So that means that now I shouldn't be singing here. And instead it's celebrated in Europe. These are some of the things that are, you know, when we talk about risk, you know, I look at Europe and I see how they celebrate the things that I do in terms of using my voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And expressing myself. So at some point, there's just looking in the mirror. And I guess if I were going to say, you know, to answer that question that you asked about white anti-racist voices, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like, how can they take more of a risk? I would say to avoid being comfortable, right?
Right.
So as an individual, like I said, looking in the mirror, you just need to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
If you are only talking to, like, if you're only, okay, how do I say this? So I saw this image of a protester, like literally protesting, and they had the sign and everything. And they literally put the sign in their backpack and just like took off the little, like, you know, whatever they had all this stuff, Black Lives Matter, and they put it all in their backpack and they like walked off, right? And this is a white person, okay? They walked off, and I don't know, I imagine them going to have like a drink, and wow, that was really like, I felt good about that protest that I was able to do. Now I'm gonna go home,
Yeah,
and I'm gonna go watch Netflix. And I'm gonna go and hang out and just chill out. I'm gonna be comfortable, right? And not until I'm ready am I gonna go back and continue to fight. Mm-hmm. So as an individual, what I would say is to avoid risk, that I would avoid being comfortable. That is you taking a risk. Go when you don't necessarily want to go. Be there and show up for people when it's not comfortable for you, right? Exactly. when it's hard. And then I would say for organizations, right? So that's as the individual, right? And so for organizations, I would say, like, again, don't be comfortable. Avoid this thing. So in the United States, right, we have this horrible cloud of slavery, right, that existed. And and there's this residue that exists everywhere.
Yeah.
And as much as there's the residue of, there's slave mentality, and then there's also master mentality. Okay.
Right. Lauren, before you go on, I think this is such a great topic. Can we take the opportunity to bring in the other panelists too to jump in on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's it's wonderful kind of starting to go in there to talk about comfort and where it lies that way. But could you please continue what you were saying?
Yeah, absolutely. So what ends up happening is that just as much as the Black community is suffering from slave mentality, the white community is also suffering from master mentality. Okay. And so what ends up happening is that part of the comfort is, okay, we have this house, we're bringing in certain Black people to work inside the house, and there's others that are outside. Okay. And what ends up happening is these certain Black people are working in the house, and we're comfortable with them. We're not comfortable with, right? There's a reason why there's distance. And so what ends up happening in modern day is organizations are bringing in certain Black people that they are comfortable with, and these end up being our token Black people. And what I would love for organizations to do is to take the risk of going outside of your comfort zone and talking to the people who are not directly affiliated with you, right? The people that have been fully and utterly oppressed, the people that you did not let into that audition, or you decided not to, for whatever reason. You don't know exactly why. Oh, but they were so qualified, but I can't pinpoint why I didn't accept them into the, into whatever it is, fill in the blank. So I would just really avoid being comfortable.
Right. So now that we have the other panelists back, you all had a chance to sort of listen to each other. I'm curious if you have anything that you want to speak to based off of what you heard from the other panelists. Can we start with Armando?
So many things come to mind, but one thing I was thinking was how something we talked about at Quinteto Latino. So Quinteto Latinos, as far as I know, and having a national voice and looking for others, the only Latino specific organization doing advocacy work and talking about race equity in a classical music field, in addition to doing performance. And one thing that, really this comes up every day with my mentees, composers, musicians, arts administrators within our team here, even when we look at funding, do we make our own systems and set up our own systems so that we can do it authentically and with cultural competency and with fairness and giving power to our voice? Or do we put our energy in working in existing systems where we work twice and 3 times as hard for the yet smaller slice of pie and have to conform to the mainstream culture? And I don't have an answer. I tell this to my mentees too, like, I don't have an answer either. Which one are you going to work? And we end up having to do both, so it's just something, I'm interested in what others have found in terms of navigating that. Do we make our own system, or do we work within the existing systems, or both?
That's a fair point. Dr.
Just
Dubois.
those marginalized communities have to work twice as hard too. Like we can't just appear and exist in this mainstream community. We have to actually make our own and do that. So we're now working twice as hard for a smaller piece of the pie, you know. And so, yeah.
Right. You're absolutely right. It's unfair to have a person of color in your organization, and you say, well, you go build the reckoning bridge, and you put all of that on them, and now all of a sudden you'll burn out twice as fast because you're doing all of this sort of work. So that happens a lot. Dr. Dubois, was there anything from the other panelists that you wanted to speak to?
I would just like to touch on what Lauren was saying, and also Armando, and just on the same thing, is that there are simply not enough voices represented in classical music to have a conversation about representation, because they're simply not represented. So for me, it's about creating numbers. And there's no tokenism when numbers are in existence, because we're all creating, and we've all been creating all this time. It's not like it's that people have just started creating all of a sudden. It's been here all along, and it's been actively suppressed all of these years. And I want to go back and find what was suppressed and celebrate it and elevate it and allow it to rise up. And I want to hear what's happening right now. And it's just, there are no excuses. It's just listen to what's around you. Lauren, you're saying, look in the mirror. I'm saying, listen too. Like, listen to yourself, like, listen to what you're saying, and to listen to what you're programming. What are you programming? What are you listening to? What are you queuing up? I mean, we've lost a lot of like ways, like I miss my CDs. There's a lot of kind of flux in even listening to things, but like, forget about what record you're putting on, what CD you're putting on, what device you're using to listen to your music. Like, where are you finding your sounds, and how are we speaking to one another? It's kind of like what I'm thinking about. How are we connecting, and how are we finding and building bridges to all of our music that has everything in common, so that we can share our inflections and just be on the same page, and not have to be in a situation where someone is overlooked after all the time. I'm sorry, it's 2020, you know?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Lauren, do you have anything that you heard from the other two panelists that you wanted to speak to, that or spoke to you?
Yeah, there's this idea of, do you go somewhere else and, create something where you have your own ability to, and then, or do you go and try and use that energy, even more energy, to try to break into a wall, break through a wall that's, completely solid. And I love this idea of sharing, right? And like this idea of, my favorite is when there's this whole mixture of people and backgrounds and different things happening. I think that's usually when, at least in the rehearsal space, from my experience, that's when the best ideas come out of the score, right? That's when the best things come, because you've got all these different perspectives and these different, each person in their culture has like a different tempo, right, of life. And like, when you bring all that together, for me, that is just like, you really get some of the best things out of the score. So as much as I love like the idea of, having all fill in the blank community creation, I also love the idea of sharing. And I also am exhausted, I think, of hearing story after story of the Black community building something like a Tulsa or we've built stuff that's been just us, and it's been burnt down literally, or destroyed in ways. So I guess I'm kind of, I don't really know what that answer is, but it is something that is curious and we have to really figure out.
Mm-hmm. The speaking of building and organization, I want to direct the next question to Armando and have him put on his other hat. He has many, and I want to say that I want to ask, as a trustee of the Castellano Family Foundation, you have a philanthropic impact on the Santa Clara County community. The foundation builds capacity to help Latino arts organizations sustain, expand, or improve arts programming. So I want to know, could you speak more to the importance of your organization and what other arts organizations can learn from it?
Sure. So I, beyond Quinteto Latino and my life as a performer and advocate, my family, I'm a second generation family member trustee. So it's not my job. I'm just a family member trustee of a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So my parents set aside wealth to be given away to the community. And similar to Quinteto Latino, we give in the Latino community here in San Jose, which is the county of Santa Clara. And we have a bigger vision actually to share how we fund the Latino community. We only get to nonprofits that are Latino led, that have diverse boards, and that are serving the Latino community. Mm-hmm. So, and how we've been doing that for 2 decades is what we share with philanthropy in general to try to spur more giving in the Latino community. And so, my work as an artist so infuses my work as a philanthropist. Because as an artist, I'm about sharing my power and giving voice to communities that aren't often heard. And how do I do that? My search as an artist is, how do I do that via the outside of the bell of my French horn and with my voice in places like here. And I feel like I bring that same aesthetic to philanthropy. How do I share the power that I have? And how do I give voice to these communities that are often unheard and not listened to? It's the same practice, and it's the same thing. And I love that about philanthropy, and it's definitely symbiotic in those relationships. But I think that I'm going to tell you one thing I do say in terms of a story and working in both these communities. I definitely say that philanthropy and classical music are like on a race to see who can become woke the slowest. They are so, we're working within very entrenched, heavily colonized, incredibly white-held spaces, and there's again, it's a race to see who can move the slowest. They're working on it, and we're talking about it a lot in both those areas, but it's slow going for sure. Feels very similar in my work in both those spaces.
Preach. So that us all being here today is just a reflection on how we all kind of cherish the same thing, which is this idea about community and being in the community and being a fabric of the community. That's part of that's once again something that we hold very dear at Longy, and giving people a chance to sort of amplify those voices and hearing from professionals who are out in the world, also embodying those characteristics. I want to take the time to thank Armando, Dr. Du Bois, and Lauren for joining us today. This was an incredibly important conversation. We at Longy are grateful to have the opportunity with you. I just want to say a special note. We are excited to be welcoming Lauren Michelle back for a donor-exclusive event on December 1st. Keep an eye out for future events for the community, including Contemplation and Action, The Mind, the Body, and Artistic Practice on February 2nd. Also, check out Longy's website for more information. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and also thank you for being a part of our community. I hope everyone has a great evening.